June 4th, 1942, 10:22 a.m. The air above the Pacific Ocean, 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, carried the salt spray and engine roar of what Imperial Japan believed would be its crowning triumph. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, flagship of the WWII, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. The morning sun reflected off calm seas. The smell of aviation fuel and salt water mixed in the warm breeze. Around him, stretched across 30 miles of ocean, sailed the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. For fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 12 destroyers. Below decks, mechanics prepared aircraft for what would be the decisive blow against American naval power in the Pacific. Nagumo watched his crews work with the precision that had destroyed Pearl Harbor, that had ravaged the British Eastern Fleet, that had made the Japanese carrier force seem invincible across half the Pacific. His planes had struck the American installations on Midway Island that morning. Now, they would annihilate the remnants of the American fleet foolish enough to challenge Japanese naval supremacy. He permitted himself a moment of satisfaction. The American carriers, those few that remained after Pearl Harbor, were reportedly still hundreds of miles away, perhaps near Hawaii, certainly not within striking range. Then, at 10:24 a.m., a lookout's voice cracked across the bridge radio. Dive bombers. Enemy dive bombers coming in from high altitude. Nagumo looked up. The sky that had been clear moments before now seemed to split open. Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, American carrier aircraft, were plunging down at 70-degree angles, their engines screaming, coming from nowhere, coming from carriers that shouldn't exist, that couldn't be here. In the next 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers of the WWII will be transformed into funeral pyres that burned so intensely their steel hulls glowed red. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility would die in those flames. And watching the impossible unfold before his eyes, Nagumo would understand too late what his intelligence officers had assured him was impossible. The Americans had been waiting. They had known. And their carriers, mocked by Japanese admirals as inferior, their crews dismissed as soft, their industrial base laughed at as incapable of sustained warfare, had delivered a blow from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover. The burning Akagi, listing and doomed, would carry down with it something more than steel and men. It carried the certainty that had defined Japanese naval thinking since Pearl Harbor, the certainty that America could not fight, could not match Japanese fighting spirit, could not produce carriers faster than Japan could sink them, could not possibly threaten the empire's expansion across the Pacific. That certainty dissolved in the flames that consumed the flight deck where Nagumo had stood so confidently just minutes before. For 18 months before Midway, the Japanese naval establishment had operated with a confidence that bordered on religious conviction. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, had validated every assumption about American weakness and Japanese superiority. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, over 300 aircraft destroyed, more than 2,000 Americans dead, all accomplished in under 2 hours by a force that suffered minimal losses. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and architect of the Pearl Harbor operation, understood American industrial potential better than most of his colleagues. He had studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington, traveled across the United States observing its factories and oil fields. His warning to Japan's political leadership was explicit. I can run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, I have no expectation of success. But Yamamoto's caution was drowned out by the voices of officers who had never seen America, who understood its power only through the lens of racial ideology and cultural contempt. To them, Americans were soft, individualistic, incapable of the sacrifice and discipline that defined the Japanese warrior spirit. The battleships burning in Pearl Harbor seemed to prove this assessment correct. The Americans had been caught sleeping, unprepared, their vaunted military power revealed as hollow. Japanese naval intelligence compiled assessments that reinforced this view. American carrier doctrine was analyzed, and found wanting, too defensive, too cautious, lacking the aggressive spirit that had carried Japanese carriers to victory after victory. American pilots were evaluated as technically proficient but spiritually weak, unable to match the fanatical devotion of Japanese naval aviators willing to die for the emperor. Most critically, Japanese planners calculated that American industrial capacity, while theoretically vast, could not be mobilized quickly enough to matter. Building a fleet carrier required 2 to 3 years under optimal conditions. The United States had lost or damaged most of its Pacific fleet at Pearl Harbor. Even if American shipyards worked at maximum capacity, Japan would have years of unchallenged supremacy to establish a defensive perimeter so vast, so heavily fortified, that American would break before American production could make a difference. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. Japan possessed 10 fleet carriers in December 1941. The United States had 7, and 3 of those had been damaged at Pearl Harbor. By mid-1942, Japanese naval planners projected they would have 12 operational fleet carriers, while American strength would remain static or even decline due to combat losses. The window of opportunity was clear. Strike hard, strike decisively, force the Americans into a climactic battle that would destroy their remaining carriers and leave Japan supreme in the Pacific. What these calculations failed to account for was something that couldn't be measured in traditional naval metrics: the fundamental difference between an economy of scarcity and an economy of abundance, between a military culture built on spiritual devotion and one built on industrial pragmatism, between a nation that saw war as the ultimate expression of national will and one that saw it as an engineering problem to be solved through overwhelming application of resources. The first cracks in Japanese certainty appeared not in grand strategic revelations, but in small, puzzling details that accumulated like water seeping through a dam. Intelligence reports from early 1942 noted unusual activity at American shipyards, accelerated construction schedules, round-the-clock shifts, a mobilization of industrial resources that seemed disproportionate to actual military necessity. Japanese naval attaches monitoring American ports before the war's outbreak had reported these observations, but they were dismissed as American posturing, inefficient allocation of resources that would prove wasteful in actual combat. Then came the Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942. 16 American B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The material damage was negligible. A few buildings damaged, minimal casualties. But the psychological impact reverberated through the Japanese Naval Command. American carriers had approached within 600 miles of Japan itself, launched an attack on the Sacred Home Islands, and escaped before Japanese forces could respond. More troubling than the raid itself was what it revealed about American carrier operations. The Hornet had been commissioned less than 3 months earlier, yet operated with a proficiency that suggested extensive training and preparation. Where had this training occurred? How had the Americans prepared a newly commissioned carrier for combat operations so quickly? Japanese intelligence struggled to answer these questions, and the answers they developed were unsettling. American shipyards weren't just repairing damaged vessels. They were producing new ones at a rate that seemed to violate every conventional understanding of naval construction timelines. Reports indicated that American aircraft production had increased dramatically, that factories across the United States were converting from civilian to military production with a speed and efficiency that Japanese planners had considered impossible for a democratic society. Admiral Yamamoto, reading these intelligence summaries, felt the weight of his earlier warnings pressing down. He proposed the Midway operation partially as a response to the Doolittle raid, but more fundamentally as an attempt to force a decisive battle before American industrial production could fully mobilize. If the remaining American carriers could be destroyed at Midway, if the atoll could be captured and used as a forward base threatening Hawaii, perhaps American will could be broken before American factories could turn the tide. But even as planning proceeded, contradictions emerged that suggested Japanese understanding of American capabilities was fundamentally flawed. Interrogations of captured American pilots revealed training programs far more extensive than Japanese intelligence had estimated. American aircrew were flying hundreds of hours before combat deployment, receiving standardized instruction that, while perhaps less spiritually intense than Japanese training, produced pilots with consistent technical proficiency. The intercepted communications suggested American naval doctrine was evolving rapidly, incorporating lessons from early engagements with a flexibility that seemed at odds with the rigid, bureaucratic American military culture Japanese analysts had described. Most puzzling were references in American communications to production schedules, to ships and aircraft that didn't yet exist but were discussed as certainties, as inevitable additions to combat strength that were merely delayed by construction timelines rather than limited by industrial capacity. A Japanese naval intelligence officer, Captain Takeo Yoshikawa, who had spent years in Hawaii before the war, submitted a report in May 1942 that his superiors found almost treasonous in its implications. He warned that American industrial mobilization was not following predictable patterns, that the United States was not behaving like a nation with limited resources carefully husbanding strength. Instead, it was behaving like a nation with functionally unlimited industrial capacity that was only just beginning to apply that capacity to military production. They are not conserving, Yoshikawa wrote. They're not calculating minimum necessary force. They're building everything, everywhere all at once. This is not the behavior of a nation afraid of resource depletion. This is the behavior of a nation that believes it can outproduce any possible enemy by such margins that efficiency becomes irrelevant. The report was noted and filed. The Midway operation proceeded, and on June 4th, 1942, the Japanese carriers that represented the Empire's most sophisticated weapon, the culmination of decades of naval development and tactical refinement, sailed into a battle where they would encounter not just American carriers, but the leading edge of an industrial avalanche that would bury Japanese naval power under a weight of steel and explosive power that no amount of fighting spirit could resist. At 10:26 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bomber squadron from the USS Enterprise rolled into their attack dive above the Japanese carrier fleet. What they saw below seemed almost impossible. 4 carriers steaming in formation, flight decks crowded with aircraft being armed and fueled, completely vulnerable, with no combat air patrol in position to defend them. For 2 hours, McCluskey's squadrons had been searching the ocean, fuel running critically low, facing the choice between continuing the search and having enough fuel to return to their carrier. McCluskey had made the decision to extend the search beyond prudent limits, gambling that the Japanese carriers had to be somewhere in the search area. Now, that gamble was paying off with a targeting opportunity that seemed too perfect to be real. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, 3 of the 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, lay below like models on a game board, their crews frantically trying to launch aircraft, their decks laden with bombs and fuel lines snaking across the wooden planking. McCluskey's pilots pushed over into their dives, the distinctive scream of the dauntless dive bomber filling the air. The first bomb struck Akagi near the amidships elevator at 10:26 a.m. The explosion penetrated to the hangar deck where armed and fueled aircraft were preparing for launch. The secondary explosions that followed were catastrophic. Aviation fuel ignited, bombs and torpedoes cooked off, fires spread with terrifying speed through spaces designed to facilitate aircraft operations, not contain infernos. At 10:26 and 30 seconds, a bomb struck Kaga's flight deck. The same sequence of destruction repeated: penetration, explosion, secondary detonations, spreading fire. At 10:27, Soryu took 3 bombs in rapid succession. In 60 seconds, 3 fleet carriers representing years of construction, training, and combat experience had been transformed into death traps for their crews. Lieutenant Chuichi Nagumo, a Japanese pilot who had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack and was aboard Soryu preparing for launch, watched the American dive bombers appear as if materializing from empty sky. His last radio transmission before the bomb struck captured the moment of realization. Enemy dive bombers overhead. We are. The transmission ended as the first bomb struck. What died in those flames was more than ships and men. It was the foundational assumption of Japanese naval strategy, that American carriers were too few, too poorly positioned, too incompetently led to threaten Japanese operations. The Americans weren't supposed to be here. Intelligence had placed them near Hawaii, days away from Midway. Yet here they were, perfectly positioned, striking at the precise moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability. Admiral Nagumo, evacuating the burning Akagi, experienced the cognitive dissonance of a man watching his certainties immolate. The Americans had known. They had been waiting. The trap he thought he was setting at Midway had been reversed, and Japanese carriers, the weapon system that had given the Empire mastery of the Pacific, were burning like torches visible for miles across the ocean. Survivors pulled from the water by Japanese destroyers told stories that seemed like fever dreams. The American dive bombers had appeared simultaneously from multiple directions, perfectly coordinated, striking at the moment when Japanese aircraft were being rearmed on deck, when fuel lines were exposed, when defensive combat air patrol had been drawn down to sea level pursuing American torpedo bombers. The timing wasn't luck. It was precision. It was calculation. It was the product of intelligence and planning that suggested American naval operations were far more sophisticated than Japanese assessments had credited. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and was aboard Akagi during the battle, later described the psychological impact. The Americans we had been taught to despise, whose carriers we had been assured were inferior, whose pilots we had been told lacked fighting spirit. These Americans had just destroyed the heart of Japanese naval power in 6 minutes. Everything we believed, everything we had been promised about American weakness, was revealed as catastrophic delusion. But the revelation at Midway was merely the surface indication of a deeper truth that Japanese naval planners were only beginning to comprehend. The carriers that had struck them, Enterprise, Yorktown, Hornet, represented not the desperate last gasp of a defeated Navy, but the first wave of an industrial mobilization that would soon flood the Pacific with American naval power on a scale that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Even as the carriers burned at Midway, American shipyards were working around the clock on construction programs that would redefine naval warfare. The Essex-class fleet carrier program, authorized before Pearl Harbor but accelerated dramatically after it, would produce 24 fleet carriers by war's end. The Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls, would add 9 more. Escort carriers, built on merchant ship hulls using mass production techniques adapted from automotive manufacturing, would number over 100 before the war concluded. Japanese naval intelligence, analyzing the Midway disaster, struggled to comprehend the implications of these production figures. Their analysts calculated ship construction rates based on Japanese experience, where each carrier represented a unique project requiring years of specialized labor. The idea that Americans could standardize carrier construction, could build them using assembly line techniques, could complete a fleet carrier in less than 18 months from keel laying to commissioning. This seemed to violate every principle of naval architecture. Yet the evidence was undeniable. By late 1942, even as Japan struggled to repair the single carrier that had survived Midway, the Hiryu, which had been scuttled after American counterattacks, left it burning. American shipyards were launching new carriers at a rate of nearly 1 per month. The USS Essex was commissioned in December 1942, just 6 months after Midway. The USS Lexington, replacing the carrier lost at Coral Sea, was commissioned in February 1943. The USS Yorktown, replacing the carrier sunk at Midway, was commissioned in April 1943. The mathematics became terrifying for Japanese naval planners. Even if Japanese submarines and aircraft managed to sink American carriers, and they occasionally did, the Americans were replacing losses faster than Japan could inflict them. More horrifying still, the Americans were building carriers in such numbers that they could afford to use some for training, keeping them in American waters to prepare new aircrews while still maintaining overwhelming strength in combat zones. Admiral Yamamoto, reading the intelligence summaries throughout late 1942, recognized that his worst predictions were manifesting. The war had reached the point he had warned about, where American industrial capacity would overwhelm Japanese fighting spirit. In a letter to a colleague in November 1942, he wrote, "We have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve. But it is worse than I feared. The giant was not sleeping, he was building. And now he comes with a fury composed not of rage, but of machinery." The industrial metrics told a story that no amount of Japanese courage or tactical skill could overcome. In 1942, American shipyards produced 8 fleet and light carriers. In 1943, they produced 15. In 1944, they produced 22. By contrast, Japan completed 3 carriers in 1942, 1 in 1943, and 4 in 1944, and most of these were conversions of existing ships rather than new construction. But carriers were merely the most visible manifestation of industrial disparity. Supporting each carrier required destroyers for escort, oilers for refueling, supply ships for provisions, ammunition ships for ordnance. The American industrial base was producing these supporting vessels at rates that seemed almost obscene to Japanese observers. In 1943 alone, American shipyards completed over 200 destroyers and destroyer escorts. Japan, struggling with resource shortages and bombing campaigns against its industrial centers, completed 29. Aircraft production revealed an even more staggering gap. In 1942, the United States produced 47,836 aircraft of all types. Japan produced 8,861. In 1943, American production reached 85,898 aircraft, while Japan managed 16,693. The quality gap was narrowing too. Early war American aircraft had been roughly equivalent to Japanese designs, but by 1943, American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat were outperforming Japanese Zeros in every measurable category, except perhaps low-speed maneuverability. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with these new American aircraft reported something that their commanders found difficult to accept. The Americans were no longer flying with caution. Early in the war, American tactics had been defensive, focused on protecting carriers and conserving strength. By mid-1943, American pilots were aggressive, willing to accept losses because they knew their losses would be replaced. They knew that for every American pilot shot down, 2 more were completing training. They knew their carriers could absorb damage and be repaired, or if sunk, would be replaced by new ones already under construction. This psychological shift, from conservation to expenditure, from careful husbanding of limited resources to aggressive employment of abundant ones, marked a fundamental change in American naval warfare. Japanese commanders had built their strategy around the assumption that Americans, as individuals who valued personal survival over collective sacrifice, would fight cautiously. Instead, they encountered American pilots and sailors who fought with the confidence of men who knew industrial production supported their sacrifice, who understood that their individual loss was tragic but strategically insignificant given the scale of replacement. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8 at Midway, later described this mindset. "We knew going in that we probably wouldn't make it back. But we also knew that if our torpedoes could damage even one carrier, 10 more American pilots would be ready to take our place tomorrow, flying from carriers that were being built faster than the Japanese could sink them." Our sacrifice wasn't futile, it was multiplication. The fuel logistics told their own story of industrial disparity. Each American carrier task force consumed thousands of gallons of fuel oil daily. The fleet oilers that accompanied these task forces were themselves technological marvels, ships capable of refueling carriers and escorts at sea, extending operational range indefinitely. American petroleum production in 1942 exceeded 1 billion barrels. Japan, having seized the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies specifically to fuel its war machine, produced approximately 50 million barrels. And much of this had to be transported through submarine-infested waters to reach Japanese refineries. The ammunition expenditure was equally revealing. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American carriers launched 956 aircraft sorties over 2 days. Japanese forces managed 373 sorties and lost 395 aircraft, including nearly all their carrier-based planes, in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The ammunition expenditure from American ships during this battle exceeded what the entire Japanese fleet had used at Midway 2 years earlier. But perhaps most demoralizing for Japanese naval personnel was the realization that American industrial capacity extended beyond mere quantity to include innovation and adaptation. When submarines proved effective against Japanese shipping, Americans produced more submarines and developed new tactics. When Japanese kamikaze attacks threatened American carriers in 1945, American shipyards responded by producing carriers with armored flight decks and enhanced anti-aircraft capabilities. The Americans weren't just building more. They were building better, incorporating combat lessons into new designs with a speed that suggested an industrial base operating at a level of sophistication Japan simply couldn't match. Captured Japanese documents from late 1944 reveal the dawning horror of recognition. A naval staff report from October 1944, analyzing American carrier strength in the Pacific, concluded the Americans possess 27 operational fleet carriers, with 12 more under construction. We possess 4 operational carriers, with none under construction. The disparity is such that numerical comparison becomes meaningless. We are not fighting a nation. We are fighting a factory that produces fleets faster than we can engage them. The report continued with calculations that read like epitaphs for Japanese naval ambitions. If we achieve a favorable exchange ratio of 2 American carriers sunk for every Japanese carrier lost, an optimistic assumption, we would exhaust our carrier strength before inflicting meaningful damage on American naval power. The Americans can afford losses we cannot. They can afford mistakes we cannot. They can afford to learn from combat experience because they will have more ships, more aircraft, more pilots to apply those lessons. We cannot afford to learn because we cannot afford to lose. Lieutenant Junior Grade Edward Butch O'Hare, flying an F-4F Wildcat fighter from the carrier Lexington in February 1942, became the Navy's first flying ace when he single-handedly attacked 9 Japanese bombers threatening his carrier, shooting down 5 and damaging several others. His radio transmission during the engagement captured something essential about the American approach to the war. They just keep coming, but so do we. And we've got more planes where this one came from. That simple statement, "We've got more planes where this one came from," represented a truth that would reshape the Pacific War. American military culture was developing around abundance rather than scarcity, around the knowledge that industrial capacity was not a limiting factor but an enabling one. Japanese naval aviators, by contrast, operated in a culture defined by limitation. Each aircraft was precious. Each pilot represented years of intensive training that couldn't easily be replaced. Japanese doctrine emphasized achieving maximum effect with minimum resources, a philosophy born from decades of operating as a resource-poor island nation. This doctrine had served Japan well in the early months of the war, when superior training and tactics allowed Japanese pilots to achieve remarkable success despite facing numerically superior opponents. But by late 1942, American industrial mobilization was transforming numerical superiority into qualitative advantage as well. New pilots arriving in the Pacific had hundreds of hours of flight training, had practiced gunnery until it became instinct, had learned tactics in dedicated training programs that treated pilot preparation as an industrial process rather than an artisanal craft. Commander James Flatley, who led fighter training programs in the United States during 1942 and 1943, described the approach. "We built pilots like Ford builds cars, standardized training, consistent quality control, assembly line efficiency. Not every pilot was an ace, but every pilot met minimum standards that would have qualified them as above average in most other air forces. And we could produce them in numbers that meant individual losses, while tragic, didn't degrade combat effectiveness. The human cost of this industrial approach was real and terrible. American casualty rates among naval aviators were significant, particularly in the early months when Japanese training and experience advantages were most pronounced. But the casualties could be absorbed and replaced because the industrial systems supporting them could produce new pilots, new aircraft, new carriers faster than combat could deplete them. Japanese naval culture struggled to adapt to this reality. The emphasis on spiritual strength, on individual prowess, on the warrior tradition that defined Japanese military identity. These values couldn't compensate for material disadvantage of the magnitude America was bringing to bear. Japanese aces like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa achieved remarkable kill counts, but even the most successful Japanese pilot couldn't shoot down aircraft faster than American factories could produce them. Letters and diaries from Japanese naval personnel reveal the psychological deterioration this realization caused. A Japanese carrier pilot, writing in his diary in early 1943, captured the despair. "Today we engaged American fighters again. I shot down 2, my wingman destroyed 1. We drove off the rest. We returned to our carrier triumphant, having lost only 1 pilot from our formation. And yet I feel we lost. The Americans will replace those aircraft tomorrow. We will not replace our lost pilot. They lose machines. We lose irreplaceable warriors. How can we win such a war?" American carriers, by contrast, were becoming not just platforms for aircraft, but floating cities of industrial capacity. The Essex-class carriers carried sophisticated machine shops, electronics repair facilities, carpentry shops, even dental and medical facilities comparable to small hospitals. These ships could operate for months without returning to port, repairing damage, maintaining aircraft, sustaining combat operations through organic capability that Japanese carriers, designed for shorter operational cycles, could not match. The contrast was visible in the aftermath of battles. When American carriers were damaged, mobile repair ships would arrive within days, bringing prefabricated parts, specialized personnel, everything needed to restore combat capability. When Japanese carriers were damaged, they often had to return to Japan for repairs, traversing thousands of miles of ocean now patrolled by American submarines, burning irreplaceable fuel, removing the carrier from combat operations for months. Captain Tamichi Hara, commanding the destroyer Shiger, witnessed this disparity firsthand during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. His ship, part of a force attacking what Japanese intelligence believed to be lightly defended American landing forces, encountered instead a massive American fleet, including multiple carrier task forces. The weight of American firepower was overwhelming, but what struck Hara most was the casual way Americans employed their resources. "They fired at us without seeming to calculate ammunition expenditure," he later wrote. Their carriers launched strikes of 50, 60 aircraft against single targets. When we damaged one of their destroyers, another immediately took its place in the formation. It was as if they had infinite resources, as if ships and ammunition and aircraft were so plentiful that conservation was unnecessary. We fought with desperate efficiency, making every shot count. They fought with overwhelming abundance, making victory inevitable through sheer material weight. The philosophical implications of this material disparity extended beyond tactics and strategy to fundamental questions about the nature of war itself. Japanese military culture, built on centuries of samurai tradition, emphasized individual prowess, spiritual purity, the warrior's virtue. American military culture, built on frontier pragmatism and industrial innovation, emphasized systemic solutions, technological advantage, overwhelming material superiority. Neither approach was inherently superior in all contexts, but in the specific circumstances of the Pacific War, a conflict spanning millions of square miles of ocean, requiring massive logistical support, demanding sustained industrial production, the American approach proved devastatingly effective. Warriors, no matter how skilled or devoted, could not overcome the industrial capacity that allowed America to treat carriers as mass-produced items rather than irreplaceable treasures. By 1944, the psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel was severe. Pilots who had survived since Pearl Harbor, an increasingly rare breed, spoke of fighting ghosts. Every American ship they sank was replaced. Every American pilot they shot down was replaced. The enemy they faced seemed to multiply with each engagement, growing stronger as Japan grew weaker, approaching with the inexorability of a mathematical proof. A Japanese naval officer, interrogated after a ship was sunk in early 1945, told his American captor something that reflected the complete psychological collapse of Japanese naval confidence. "We knew we were beaten when we stopped celebrating victories. Even when we sank your ships, damaged your carriers, shot down your aircraft, we knew it didn't matter. You would replace them. You always replace them." Fighting America was like fighting the ocean. We could not wound something so vast it didn't notice the injury. The human dimension of this industrial warfare manifested in countless small moments. American sailors on the carrier Intrepid, after their ship was hit by kamikazes twice in 1944, watched the repair crews arrive with prefabricated flight deck sections that allowed the carrier to return to combat operations within days. Japanese sailors, hearing of this, could barely comprehend it. A carrier so severely damaged returning to combat so quickly, repaired not in a shipyard but at sea, using mass-produced parts delivered by supply ships from a nation 8,000 miles away. The mail call aboard American carriers revealed another dimension of industrial abundance. Letters from home described war plants operating around the clock, women working in factories producing ships and aircraft, entire communities mobilized for production. American sailors knew, with certainty, that their sacrifices were supported by an entire nation transformed into an industrial arsenal. Japanese sailors, by contrast, received letters describing food shortages, bombing raids, resource depletion, evidence that the home front was suffering even as the military demanded greater sacrifice. This difference in civilian experience reflected the fundamental economic disparity. The United States was producing so much military equipment that civilian consumption, while restricted by rationing, remained at levels that would have seemed luxurious to Japanese civilians. Americans complained about butter rationing, while Japanese subsisted on progressively smaller rice rations. The war was straining American capacity, but not breaking it. The war was consuming Japan's economic foundation entirely. The children of American factory workers would later recall their parents speaking of the war effort with a kind of grim pride. They were building the weapons that would end the war, were participating in an industrial mobilization that gave meaning to sacrifice. The children of Japanese factory workers recalled desperation. Never enough materials, never enough food, always the American bombers overhead destroying what had been built with such effort. When Japanese veterans met American veterans in the decades after the war, a common theme emerged in their conversations. The Japanese veterans spoke of courage, of tactical excellence, of spiritual fortitude. The American veterans spoke of logistics, of production schedules, of the satisfaction of knowing their forces had everything they needed. Both groups had fought with honor, but they had fought fundamentally different wars. One a war of spirit against scarcity, the other a war of industrial capacity applied with mathematical precision. In the years following Japan's surrender, in August 1945, historians and participants alike attempted to understand the totality of what had transpired in the Pacific War. The industrial statistics were compiled, analyzed, compared. The numbers told a story of disparity so vast it seemed almost absurd. Total ship tonnage constructed during the war years revealed the clearest picture. The United States produced approximately 33 million tons of merchant shipping and 11 million tons of naval vessels between 1941 and 1945. Japan produced approximately 3 million tons of merchant shipping and 1 million tons of naval vessels during the same period. The American advantage in ship production was approximately 10 to 1. Aircraft production showed similar disparity. The The United States produced 324,750 aircraft of all types during the war. Japan produced 76,320. The ratio was more than 4-to-1, and this didn't account for the qualitative improvements that made late-war American aircraft superior to their Japanese counterparts in most performance categories. But raw numbers alone didn't capture the full scope of industrial mobilization. The United States had simultaneously fought a two-front war, providing massive material support to the Soviet Union and Britain through Lend-Lease, while maintaining overwhelming superiority against Japan in the Pacific. American industry was producing enough to supply multiple armies on multiple continents, while still maintaining civilian consumption at levels that allowed social stability. Admiral Yamamoto's prediction that he could run wild for 6 months to a year before American industrial capacity overwhelmed Japan had proven remarkably accurate. Midway occurred almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The industrial avalanche he had predicted began manifesting in late 1942 and became overwhelming by 1943. By 1944, American material superiority was so pronounced that Japanese military planners were reduced to hoping for a negotiated settlement before complete national collapse. The post-war interrogations of Japanese military leadership revealed the dawning understanding of what they had faced. Admiral Somu Toyota, who commanded the combined fleet in the war's final year, told interrogators, "We had planned for a war against American battleships and American carriers. We found ourselves fighting American factories. Every tactical victory we achieved was strategically meaningless because the Americans simply built more of whatever we had destroyed. We were fighting an enemy whose resources were so vast that our best efforts could not meaningfully degrade their strength." German military observers, who had maintained contact with Japan throughout the war, drew similar conclusions. A German naval liaison officer in Tokyo, reporting to Berlin in late 1944, wrote, "The Japanese speak of American material superiority as if it were a force of nature, an earthquake or typhoon against which human effort is futile. They miscalculated not the American will to fight, which they correctly identified as initially weak, but the American capacity to fight, which proved effectively infinite relative to Japanese ability to inflict damage." The moral and philosophical implications of this material disparity became subjects of intense debate in post-war Japan. Some argued that Japanese defeat proved the superiority of democratic industrial systems over authoritarian ones, that American economic freedom had enabled mobilization on a scale that centrally planned economies could not match. Others contended that Japan's defeat was inevitable given resource disadvantages that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. What emerged from these debates was a recognition that modern warfare between industrial nations was fundamentally different from historical conflicts. The samurai tradition, the warrior ethos, the emphasis on spiritual strength, these had value, but they could not substitute for steel and oil and aluminum. The Pacific War had been, at its core, an industrial conflict, and the side with greater industrial capacity had won with mathematical inevitability. The reconstruction of Japan, guided by American occupation authorities, absorbed this lesson completely. The post-war Japanese economic miracle was built explicitly on the recognition that industrial capacity was the foundation of national power, that efficient production and technological innovation mattered more than martial tradition. The zaibatsu that had built Japan's war machine were reformed and redirected toward civilian production, applying the same organizational principles to peacetime industry that had proven insufficient for military purposes but were devastatingly effective in commercial competition. American military planning was similarly transformed by the Pacific War experience. The conflict validated the emphasis on industrial mobilization, on logistics and supply, on the integration of production capacity into strategic planning. Future American military doctrine would assume that industrial superiority could compensate for tactical disadvantages, that given time to mobilize, American productive capacity could overwhelm any opponent. The carrier warfare that had defined the Pacific conflict became a case study and how technological and industrial advantages could negate traditional measures of military strength. The Japanese had possessed superior tactics, better trained pilots, more combat experience at the war's beginning. Within 18 months, American industrial production had negated all these advantages, flooding the Pacific with carriers, aircraft, and pilots in such numbers that Japanese qualitative superiority became irrelevant. By 1960, when former enemies met at reconciliation ceremonies, American and Japanese veterans found common ground in acknowledging what the war had demonstrated. A former Japanese carrier pilot, speaking at one such event, captured the consensus: "We fought with courage." You fought with courage, but you also fought with factories, with shipyards, with an industrial system that made courage only one factor among many. We believed spirit could overcome material disadvantage. You proved that sufficient material advantage makes spirit merely the deciding factor between otherwise equal forces, and our forces were never equal. The technological legacy of the Pacific War extended far beyond military applications. The industrial techniques developed to mass-produce carriers, modular construction, standardized components, assembly line methods applied to complex systems, would transform post-war shipbuilding and eventually influence manufacturing across all sectors. The logistics systems developed to supply carrier task forces across thousands of miles of ocean would inform post-war commercial shipping and global supply chain development. The radar and communications technologies refined through carrier operations would become foundations of post-war electronics industries. The aircraft catapults and arresting gear developed for carrier operations would influence commercial aviation technology. The war had been an engine of innovation driven by industrial competition, and its technological fruits would reshape the post-war world. But perhaps the most profound legacy was psychological. The Pacific War had demonstrated conclusively that industrial democracies, when fully mobilized, could outproduce authoritarian states by margins that made military outcomes inevitable. This lesson would inform Cold War strategy, where American leaders consistently emphasized industrial and technological superiority over numerical advantages in conventional forces. The carrier, symbol of American naval power, would remain the centerpiece of American military projection, a floating reminder that industrial capacity translated directly into strategic dominance. The Japanese admirals who had mocked American carriers before Midway, who had dismissed American industrial potential as irrelevant to warrior spirit, had learned the hardest lesson in military history: that wars between industrial nations are won in factories before they are fought in battles. Their contempt had been rooted in cultural confidence, in centuries of tradition that emphasized individual prowess over collective production. That confidence had died in the flames at Midway, consumed by bombs delivered from carriers that represented not just naval power, but the full weight of American industrial civilization. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier force at Midway, died by suicide during the Battle of Saipan in July 1944, choosing death over the dishonor of witnessing complete Japanese defeat. His final messages to headquarters acknowledged what he had learned too late. The Americans possess resources beyond calculation. Each battle we win costs them less than it costs us. Each battle we lose destroys strength we cannot replace. We are fighting an enemy that treats our greatest weapons as expendable commodities. The carriers that burned at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, had represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval development, the culmination of decades of design refinement and tactical innovation. Their loss was catastrophic, not just militarily, but psychologically, shattering the myth of Japanese naval invincibility. But what made their loss truly decisive was not that they couldn't be replaced. Japan did build more carriers, but that American industrial production ensured that replacing them was strategically meaningless. By war's end, the United States Navy operated more than 90 carriers of all types. Japan operated none. The last Japanese carrier, Hasho, had been relegated to training duties in 1944 and survived the war only because it was considered too obsolete to be worth attacking. The transformation from Japanese carrier superiority in December 1941 to complete American dominance by August 1945 was the story of industrial mobilization overcoming tactical excellence, of factories defeating fighting spirit, of abundance overwhelming scarcity. The post-war world order that emerged was shaped fundamentally by the lessons of this industrial victory. The United Nations, the Bretton Woods financial system, the network of alliances and trade relationships that defined the post-war era, all were built on the recognition that industrial democracies possessed inherent advantages in sustained conflicts. The Cold War nuclear balance would rest on American confidence that Soviet industrial capacity, while formidable, could not match American production in a prolonged arms race. That confidence proved justified when the Soviet Union collapsed under the economic strain of attempting to compete with American industrial and technological capacity. The carrier itself became the symbol of this industrial approach to military power. Each American supercarrier commissioned in the post-war decades represented not just a warship, but a mobile city, a floating demonstration of industrial capability, a statement that American productive capacity could create and sustain weapons platforms of such complexity and scale that they constituted strategic advantages in themselves. When American carriers sailed into international waters during crises, they carried not just aircraft, but the implicit message that they represented a fraction of American military power, that they could be replaced if lost, that behind them stood an industrial base capable of producing more. Japanese industrial development in the post-war period internalized these lessons completely. The Toyota production system, which would revolutionize global manufacturing, was built explicitly on principles learned from studying American industrial methods during the war. Just-in-time manufacturing, continuous improvement, the emphasis on eliminating waste. These were Japanese refinements of American mass production techniques observed during the conflict. The student had learned from the teacher, adapting American methods to Japanese culture, creating hybrid systems that would eventually compete with American industry on commercial terms. When Japanese automotive and electronics manufacturers began outcompeting American firms in the 1970s and 1980s, they were applying lessons learned from military defeat. They had understood that industrial competition, like industrial warfare, rewarded efficiency, innovation, and the ability to mobilize resources effectively. The same organizational principles that had allowed American factories to produce carriers faster than Japan could sink them were now being used, refined, and improved by Japanese companies to produce cars and televisions that American consumers preferred to domestic products. The historical irony was profound. Japan had lost the military competition of the 1940s because it couldn't match American industrial production. It won significant commercial competition in the post-war decades by mastering the industrial techniques that had defeated it militarily. The wheel had turned, but the lesson remained constant. In modern civilization, industrial capacity is power, and those who master production master their destiny. Veterans of the Pacific carrier battles, meeting in old age, recognized these continuities. An American pilot who had flown from Enterprise at Midway, encountering a Japanese pilot he had fought against, remarked on the strange trajectory of history. "We beat you with factories then. You're beating us with factories now." Maybe the real lesson is that it was always about the factories, never really about the fighting. We just had to learn that lesson through war. You learned it from losing the war. Either way, we both learned. The Japanese veterans' response captured the wisdom of age and experience. At Midway, I believed in spirit over steel. I was young and foolish. Steel won, as it always does when present in sufficient quantity. But steel alone is not enough. It must be shaped by purpose, directed by strategy, employed with wisdom. America had the steel and learned the wisdom. Japan learned the wisdom from lacking the steel. Perhaps that is the only teaching that can come from so much destruction. The final accounting of the Pacific War revealed truths that transcended military history and touched on fundamental questions about human civilization. The conflict had been, at its essence, a test of two different approaches to modernity, one that emphasized spiritual unity and martial tradition, the other that emphasized industrial capacity and material abundance. The outcome had been decisive. Industrial capacity, when mobilized effectively, could overwhelm martial tradition. Factories could defeat fighting spirit. Abundance could overcome discipline. The mathematics of production made victory inevitable regardless of tactical brilliance or individual courage. But the victory carried with it a burden of understanding. The Americans who had built those carriers, who had manned those factories, who had produced the material wealth that won the war, recognized that they had demonstrated something both powerful and troubling about modern warfare. They had proven that industrial nations could conduct warfare on scales that made individual human sacrifice almost meaningless, that the same productive capacity that created prosperity could create destruction on unprecedented scales. The Japanese, in defeat, learned that isolation from global industrial networks was fatal, that resource-poor nations could not compete militarily with resource-rich ones, that the warrior tradition, however noble, could not substitute for steel and oil. These lessons would inform Japan's post-war trajectory, its emphasis on trade and alliance, its rejection of military power in favor of economic influence. The admirals who had mocked American carriers before Midway had been wrong in every particular. American carriers were not inferior. They were the products of an industrial system that could refine designs rapidly, incorporating combat lessons into new construction. American crews were not soft. They were trained in programs that treated pilot production as an engineering problem to be solved through systematic instruction. American industrial capacity was not irrelevant. It was the decisive factor that made all tactical considerations secondary to the basic mathematics of production. At 10:22 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, Admiral Nagumo had stood on Akagi's bridge confident in Japanese superiority, certain of American weakness, assured by years of careful planning and tactical refinement that his carriers were the finest weapons in the Pacific. For minutes later, that certainty was burning. 6 minutes later, it was ash. The flames that consumed the Japanese carriers at Midway burned more than ships. They burned the illusion that spirit could overcome steel, that tradition could defeat innovation, that a warrior culture could prevail against an industrial one. They burned the Japanese Navy's confidence, its strategic assumptions, its vision of Asian dominance under Japanese leadership. And from those flames emerged a new reality, one where American carriers, produced in numbers that seemed impossible, operating with efficiency that seemed mechanical, supported by logistics that seemed unlimited, ruled the Pacific not through superior fighting spirit, but through overwhelming material advantage. The industrial democracy had mobilized its strength and demonstrated that free people, working in free markets, could produce more, innovate faster, and fight harder than any authoritarian system could match. The Japanese admirals had mocked American carriers as inferior weapons operated by soft crews from a nation lacking warrior spirit. Midway burned their fleet alive and taught them the truth. America's carriers were merely the visible edge of an industrial colossus that, once awakened, could not be stopped by courage alone, could not be defeated by tactics, could not be overcome by any force that lacked equivalent productive capacity. They had laughed at American weakness. The laughter died in the flames at Midway, consumed by the same fire that would eventually consume the empire itself. The fire of industrial warfare waged by a nation that understood that modern power flows not from the sword, but from the factory that produces swords faster than the enemy can break them. The lesson echoed across decades, a warning carved in steel and written in fire. Never mock the productive capacity of a free people aroused to righteous purpose. For they will build not just enough to win, but enough to make victory inevitable, to make resistance futile, to make defeat not just possible, but mathematically certain. The Japanese admirals learned this lesson at Midway, watching their carriers burn under American bombs delivered from carriers that shouldn't exist by pilots who weren't supposed to be there, in numbers that defied every calculation. They learned it too late to save their ships, too late to save their navy, too late to save their empire. But they learned it absolutely. And the flames that taught them, visible for miles across the Pacific, burning through the day and into the night, remain visible still, a reminder that in the mathematics of industrial war, abundance defeats discipline, production overcomes courage, and factories ultimately defeat fighting spirit. The Americans hadn't just sunk carriers at Midway. They had sunk certainty itself, replaced it with the terrible knowledge that when industrial democracies mobilize their full strength, victory is not a question of will, but of time. Time for the factories to build, for the shipyards to launch, for the assembly lines to deliver the weapons that make tactical excellence irrelevant, and fighting spirit merely the last consolation of the defeated.